Today we'll be reading and discussing an article by Paul Biggar, Dark's new backend will be in F#. I stumbled upon this article 3-4 days ago and it got my interest. I would like to share my comments with you about that. Before we start, let's first talk about Dark. What is Dark? So Dark is this tool for removing complexity when creating web applications. Specifically, it's about accidental complexity. So it's usually this kind of complexity that happens when you're creating a program, but in the ideal world, you shouldn't have to think about it. A good example of that is infrastructure and somehow connected to that, deployment. So when you are preparing the hosting or the place where you want to put your application in production, there are so many tools you have to consider. You can, for example, use Docker, Kubernetes. You have to configure your web server. You have to then think about how to move the code from your development environment to the production environment. This is deployment, and there are a lot of tools for that. So in a nutshell, you have to know a lot about all those tools. And then it's not only infrastructure. I would argue that it's also about the backend, which programming languages you should choose and, how to connect, which ways of connecting front end and backend of a web application use. Like you can do RPC, you can do REST, you can do GraphQL, and each of those tools have like the little things you have to know and consider for different scenarios. So there's a lot of things to know. There's a lot of things to consider, and this takes time. It may be overwhelming. And if you are building something like a business, you need to act fast. So something like Dark is an attempt. They try to solve that problem for you. That's the selling point. Their attempt is to provide this holistic system, which consists of infrastructure, a programming language, and a custom editor that are combined into one thing, so that you can just focus on building your application. So in the case of Dark, they are talking about this idea of deploy-less programming, where it's somehow like you were developing it in production directly, or maybe a better description would be that they try to blend the production environment with the development environment, so that you don't have to distinguish that, and then you don't have those problems of infrastructure and deployment because it's the one thing. So that's a very ambitious goal, and I'm very excited about this project. So when I read this headline, I was curious about it, and I would like to share with you my comments. So let's read it. I need to note that this is a part of a series. So Paul wrote 3 articles, leaving OCaml. So when he enumerates reasons why OCaml is not perfect for this particular scenario, and then he also discussed why he didn't choose Rust. Both of them are pretty interesting. If you are interested in me discussing that, we can also take a look at those 2 other articles. So let's start reading. Nothing in my life so far would have prepared me for the fact that I would be willfully choosing to move to .NET. And I relate to that feeling. I'm not a big fan of Microsoft, and I think you noticed that. I'm old enough to know that Microsoft is not the best company, to put it mildly, but at the same time, Microsoft has amazing talent. I would argue that the research team, or the people who are designing programming languages, they assembled a stellar, one of the best programming language designers are working for Microsoft. So anything from C#, TypeScript, which is the same person, in fact, to any other things related to innovation in programming, Microsoft did a lot in that. But my lack of enthusiasm for Microsoft comes from like early age. So in 2002, when I was starting my computer science degree, during our studies we had to choose a path. We had two paths, and the one was .NET, which was very aggressively promoted by Microsoft. So our university was collaborating with Microsoft, and if you selected the path of .NET and C#, you could like pass plenty of certificates. We were, in fact, passing certificates during lectures. So we had those like lectures and those workshops, and then we were asked to like go to the Microsoft website, and we could pass like 5 or 6 or 7 certificates during 1 hour. And this way, Microsoft was trying, to hook us with, was trying to make us, familiar with the platform, and then maybe it was somehow psychological, because you could say, well, now I have like so many certificates from Microsoft that I could like go there to the market and say, that I know a lot of things. So I didn't like this approach. It was opportunistic in my view, and I selected the second path, which was Java, or Java EE at that time. But I think things are changing, and now Microsoft is very, well, they own a lot in regarding to the tools we use. So there's GitHub, there's NPM, there's VS Code, TypeScript, of course, and they are doing a lot of innovation in .NET itself. And one of them is F#. So the future seems pretty interesting. So let's continue with the article. I've been evaluating new languages for the Dark backend over the last 2 months or so. For a bunch of reasons, OCaml has been a little unsatisfactory. So again, I understand that, because I was exposed to OCaml for the first time in 2005 during I moved to France for my computer science degree, and one of the first courses I had was about compilers, and we were asked to create a compiler for either Pascal or C, and they told us you have to use this language I haven't heard of called OCaml, and it was like kind of surprise. And I didn't really like this language because it was strange. The syntax was completely different from what I've been used to so far. I could say that I really hated the language at that time, but I was wrong. I just didn't understand the language, and what it brings to the table. But at the same time, OCaml was always this academic, so this language that has a lot of interesting ideas, but it was in this academic circle. Many of my friends from the university, they started, for example, a PhD, and they were working in the OCaml realm. So, for example, they were working on investigating certain parts of OCaml, or like contributing libraries and other stuff. So it was very active in France at that time, but outside it was kind of, I think no one really knew about OCaml that much. Up to the point where Facebook started doing things with OCaml. So I think Facebook hired a lot of people from France, and specifically from research, but I'm not entirely sure about that, so feel free to correct me in the comments. And they were using OCaml to improve, from what I know, the PHP virtual machine. And then at some point, the language was being used more and more. And at some point, they released this thing called Reason, which was like new syntax for OCaml. So, so OCaml syntax may be difficult to get used to it, and I think they've seen that. So they created a new syntax which was kind of similar to JavaScript, yet it was OCaml, and they started promoting this language. I've seen this interview with a creator of React.js, Jordan Walk, and he said I think, if I remember that correctly, that he initially wanted to use something like ML, and he was playing with standard ML when creating React.js, but then he just did it in JavaScript. And now with Reason, it's possible for him and for others to execute this idea in its full, scope. Let's shortly talk about OCaml a little bit more. So OCaml is a part of ML family. So it's ML is one of the, so it was a programming language that was created in 73. It's one of the oldest programming languages. There are a few dialects right now. First was standard ML, and then there is OCaml, which is and was popular in France. And now we have F#. This, we could say, an ML that runs on top of .NET. So if you're interested about ML, how this family, how it's placed in history, I recommend you watch the talk by Rachel Reese, A Brief History of F#. PolyConf is a conference I was organizing in the past, and in 2016 I invited Rachel, and we decided to do this talk to help promote the F# a little bit more. At that time, Rachel was working at this company called Jet.com, which was an e-commerce platform that was entirely written in F#. So it was backend and frontend, everything was written in F#. And at some point, Jet.com was acquired by Walmart for $3 billion, which is quite amazing. But then they winded it down. So I'm curious what happened to their code base. Do Walmart still uses F#, and what's the situation right now? I'm not sure exactly when Jet.com was, in which year they started doing that, but after, let's say, 4 or 5 years creating the platform and using F#, they were able to sell it for $3 billion and using a very obscure technology, because F# now is much more developed than it was in 4 or 5 years ago. So F# is this programming language that's functional, cross-platform, and it's ML on top of .NET. So then Paul explains that initially I expected to go to Rust. Rust has excellent tooling, great libraries, and delightful community. But after spending a month on it, I can't say I like writing Rust. So again, I feel you. I had a similar experience. In Rust, you have to know a lot about what happens under the hood. And if you want to deliver something, if you want to sell something, if you're building a business, maybe it's not the best use of your time. Using a higher level programming language may be better in that scenario. But that doesn't mean, Rust is bad. It's just sometimes you have to find the proper trade-off. By using a higher level programming language, you can be more productive. You can just deliver things faster. I evaluated and expected not to like F#. I actually quite like it. It's close enough to OCaml, has great library support and tooling, which so far has been a mix of great and terrible. Why did I choose F#? F# is OCaml. It's OCaml backed by the world's largest and most experienced creators of programming languages. So that's, again, a very true statement. First of all, it's the same family of programming languages, as we said. And then the switch seems very minimal in terms of, it's just a matter of adapting maybe a few things and porting it. It's not like a different paradigm. And then you have Microsoft, which is backing the language, and it's built on top of .NET. And so the main reason I choose .NET was the libraries. It was libraries for everything. It has libraries for everything. I had a similar experience with Java. So, you have Java, and then you have JVM, Java Virtual Machine. And JVM is very polyglot. There are many programming languages you can use, and then you can compile to JVM. So for example, I was using, besides using Java or Scala, I also use programming languages such as Groovy or even Clojure, and we can, use them because we wanted to leverage those interesting features or write the software in a different way. And then we had access to those libraries because JVM and .NET are like two big platforms. And if you have a very obscure technology, you can be sure that you can find it among those libraries. At the beginning, I was working in the banking industry, and we were working with a very little-known technologies, something like Tuxedo or what was the name? BIA systems. So these are proprietary solutions that are being sold to large companies such as banks for large quantities of money. And usually you can find better things in open source, but for some reason those banks choose to buy those things. And if you use a new programming language where you have to develop all the libraries from scratch, you can be sure that you wouldn't be able to find those tools for those technologies. And because Java and .NET are so old, you can find those libraries easy. So if you are betting on such huge ecosystem, it's just more productive and it's easier to develop software. You don't have to worry about that. So that's not the case for OCaml. So OCaml doesn't have this. They have to. There are plenty of libraries in OCaml, but it's not nowhere close to what JVM or .NET has. So by switching from OCaml to F#, that only reason would be enough for me to switch, just to have access to those libraries. And there is a funny thing Paul mentions. Let's read. I think most of this is due to the size of community. I've heard people say that there are very few F# developers, something like there is 1 million C# users, 100,000 Visual Basic users, and 10,000 F# users, or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what counts as user, but I would imagine that OCaml has fewer than 100 users in this metric. Again, I relate to that because OCaml is a fantastic community, but it's very small. And sometimes when you're stumbling on a problem, let's say you are using an HTTP client and you discover that it's not implemented fully to the spec and you need certain things, you need to just dig into that and you have to improve it on your own. So it's very rough on the edges and the community is active but small, so they are not enough to take care of all those problems. And you can have just, strange things coming out of nowhere and you have to deal with them. While in .NET or Java, you have already this established system. Then he talks quickly about the things that are not great. Not everything is amazing though. The build system is atrocious, while Packet is roughly on par with SE. MS Build is 1,000 times worse than Dune. An incremental build in Dune is like 1 second for me and 6 seconds in .NET, even if nothing is happening. So I'm not that familiar with that, but I imagine it would be easier for Microsoft to fix that because they have resources than for OCaml. But then I'm interested, if Facebook at some point will come in and maybe help with that, or probably they are helping, but I wonder how much more they can help if they can help in the same way that Microsoft is helping with F#. And at the end, he dives into F# code being compiled to WASM using Blazor. So Blazor is this new thing for building client applications. You can write C# and then it's available on the client. You don't have to write JavaScript. It's somehow similar to Google Web Toolkit from the past. We'll see how it plays out. So you can, if you're using F#, you can do the same thing. Let's maybe skip this part because we haven't read this. If you're interested, we can read it later. And at the end, he mentions that the plan for switching from OCaml to F#. So the plan is very specific, but it seems as a lot of work. So so finger crossed, Paul. We'll see how it goes. But in the end, I think it's an interesting decision, especially that if you already have a product and you decide to switch to a different backend, to a different programming language. We'll see how it plays out. I'm excited about the outcome. Good luck to you, Paul. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.